Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining this breakout session. My name is Samantha Yanity. I am the Justice Educator at Intercommunity Peace and Justice Center in Seattle, Washington. This afternoon's breakout session is called Hidden in Plain Sight, Human Trafficking, where I will go through some, but not all, of the aspects of human trafficking, as this topic is very complex. Let's begin. When you think of the phrase enslaved person, who do you imagine? What is their age? What is their race? What do they look like? What era do they live in? What country do they live in? What is their gender? Who are they? I'd like you to take a moment now and think of these questions and think about who is this person that you're imagining. Now, when you hear the phrase human trafficking, what do you think of? Perhaps you think of a popular television show like Law and Order. Maybe you think automatically of a woman. Maybe you think of a movie like Taken that talks about a stranger capturing someone and trafficking them. These are not wrong images. They just don't tell the full picture. And often in media and in film, they're sensationalizing the topic. It's not that the issue is not dire, it is. It's just often these films or the media or TV shows are trying to tell a compelling story and they're not capturing the full story. When we think and talk about human trafficking, we often have a tendency to think that it's something in the past. Just like with racism, a lot of people believe that racism is in the past. But as many of us know, that's not the case. It's very much alive today. This is the same case with human trafficking. This is in the present moment. Sometimes we think that this is a modern phenomenon, that this is just something that's not connected to the past. But human trafficking is connected to the past and present moment. Often we think that human trafficking only deals with the buying and selling of sex, and that this issue doesn't happen in the United States. But that is not the case either. Labor trafficking is a huge part of human trafficking, and this can also occur with people who are well educated as well. In the past, we used to refer to sex slavery as white slavery, which is false for a multitude of reasons, because not only is it a racist statement, erasing the slavery that occurred amongst Africans and those of Latinx descent, but it also gives the impression that sex slavery only happens among white women of European descent, and that's not true either. There's also an idea that human trafficking requires some sort of smuggling or kidnapping, which could happen, but doesn't always happen. And there's also a belief that this couldn't possibly happen to me or anyone that I know. But this is a global issue, so it could happen to anybody of any race, of any age, of any circumstance, of any education level. According to the International Labor Organization, there is an estimated 40 million people worldwide trafficked globally. In the United States, it's 4,500 to 17,500 people trafficked annually. And this picture that I have here is of the United States of migrant workers, and migrant workers are many of the people that get trafficked. They are often very vulnerable due to their immigration status, because many migrant workers are undocumented. Out of the 40 million people worldwide that are trafficked, 25% of them are children, and 71% are women and girls. So I had you in the beginning imagine an enslaved person and what that person might look like. And perhaps you thought of the past, but I'm hoping that you thought of people both past and present, because human trafficking is another phrase for slavery. And we can see through these images, past and present, that the technology might have changed over the years, but essentially the purpose behind it did not. The purpose is to exploit people. So while we're thinking about the Atlantic slave trade for a minute, let's talk a little bit more. So because of the Atlantic slave trade, over 10 million people were taken from Africa, and this essentially caused the erasure of generations of people, which led to African nations that were involved in the Atlantic slave trade, or I should say subjugated to the Atlantic slave trade. There was a collapse of their economies because with no people there to work, they were not putting money into the local economy because the people were not there, which left nations vulnerable to conquest and colonization to Europeans. This is because many of the 10 million that were taken from Africa were men, and men at the time were the ones that were in combat and defending their borders and their nations. So without those people, there was no one there to protect the nation, no form of combat, or very minimized form of combat. So with the rise of conquest and colonization of Europeans, this led to warfare and instability. So why am I bringing this all up? Because this directly connects to what is happening now with modern day slavery. So I want you to take this information, hold on to it, and we'll return to it a little bit later. Before we do, let's get into what exactly human trafficking is. So human trafficking is done in a very specific way. It has to take an action. That action can be all of these together, or one of these things, or a combination. Recruiting, harboring, transporting, or obtaining. Somehow you're taking that person and using them for profit. And how this is done is through force, fraud, and coercion. Unless the victim is under age 18. In most places, if the person is under age 18, force, fraud, or coercion don't have to occur in order for it to be considered human trafficking because they are under the age of consent. So what do I mean by all of this? This chart breaks it down. You can see the formula. The act plus the means plus the purpose equals human trafficking. So the act, like I said before, is recruitment, transportation, or harboring of a person. Plus, it has to be done in this way. Force, fraud, or coercion, unless you're under the age of 18, then it automatically is. And then the purpose across the board for human trafficking are these things: sex, labor, or both. What do these jobs look like? It can be migrant workers. They can be factory workers. Like I said before, it can be sex trafficking, exploitation of the human body in person. Sometimes they might work in a health spa or in a salon or a massage parlor. In other cases, like this child here, he works on a plantation for coffee beans, harvesting coffee beans. This person is a domestic worker. They could be working in a hotel or cleaning someone's house. These are all different forms of trafficking. Human trafficking is a $150 billion industry. That's why it hasn't ceased to be. In almost every country all around the world, it's illegal. Slavery is illegal. But human trafficking still continues because of how much money it makes. So let's look at the root causes. One root cause is war and forced migration. Globally, the United Nations estimates that 70 million people are currently displaced. And this is for a multitude of reasons, but one of those reasons could be war and conflict zones. And in war and conflict zones, people are vulnerable to trafficking because they're trying to find refuge and they're trying to find a means of safety. And that is a perfect opportunity for two things. One, a trafficker can recruit young people into war, offering them some kind of incentive. Or two, if they're looking for refuge or housing or immigration status, a trafficker will take advantage of somebody in a vulnerable position because they're trying to find a way to survive. So what this does is it creates what we call commodification, which means treating people like objects, and that's essentially what human trafficking does. And so a lot of times the reason why these things, this issue occur is because of poverty, systems that were put into place, and people cannot get out of the cycle. So they often will either traffic their own family members, or maybe they'll be forced into a position where they have to take on a role in order to help their family. Another major component of trafficking is the demand for cheap good labor and services. So the more we produce these cheap goods, it encourages cheap labor. It will lower the value. It's not that the work lowers in value, it's just the price that people are willing to pay for that labor. It doesn't mean that the people laboring get that money. They often do not. But they'll still be exploited. So one example of how we're complicit in human trafficking, often without even noticing it, is through our technology. As you can see from the left-hand side, this woman is taking a selfie, something that we are very familiar of. She's probably enjoying her day, maybe had a latte, adjusting her hair in the lighting, taking a picture. She's probably not realizing who is making her phone, which is the young miners, these young boys that are mining. They often use young boys for two reasons. One is because their bodies are small enough to fit into the mining shaft and into the hole, and also because men and boys have a tendency to have a higher amount of upper body strength. Not necessarily, I'm not trying to gender stereotype, but they often have larger upper body strength, and this is very demanding work. And so when they mine, they're mining primarily the primary minerals that go into our electronics are tungsten, tin, tantalum, and gold. And with these four things combined, they create the energy needed to operate them. So this laptop that I'm speaking into to create this video for you is made from these minerals, and the phone that you might be swiping through to access this video are made from these minerals. And these minerals, the reason why I'm bringing them up, are considered conflict minerals, which means that literally people will fight in wars for these minerals because they're so valuable, because they contribute to this huge profit that I've been talking. Part of that $150 billion profit is through making these electronics. You think about how often, for example, Apple churns out these products. Well, the reason why I specifically brought this up is because I want you to also think back to a few slides before where I brought up the Atlantic slave trade and the impact that the Atlantic slave trade had. If you think of the Atlantic slave trade, the countries that are doing the mining are countries that were impacted by the Atlantic slave trade, which will make sense on this slide. So I want you to look at this map. Take a look at this map. If you look, for example, at the part of the map where it says that's dark indigo color, those are the 100%. Those are countries like our country, the United States, Canada, Western Europe, Australia. If you think about those countries, those were countries that had colonizers that had sent ships from the Atlantic. They created the Atlantic slave trade, but they sent ships from countries like Portugal, Italy, Spain, Britain, France. They went out to the global, what we call the global South, which is like Latin America, like basically the whole entire bottom half of the globe, Africa, Asia. If you look at this map, the spots in the world are that have the 100%. That's the highest amount of electronic use, and they use the most electronics, and they're the wealthiest countries in the world. If you look at the countries that have very little color on the map, that is an indicator of they have very few access to the electronics. They have the highest level of trafficking in those countries. They're the ones producing the labor. So they're using the least amount of energy, and they often don't have access to the electronics that they make. So we can think about this because most of us are persons of faith. If we think about Jesus, okay, Jesus was a day laborer. He built for the wealthy, right? And people often ask the question, well, why don't we have the stuff that Jesus made? Well, he probably never seen any of the stuff. He saw the things that he made, but he never saw the fruits of his labor, most likely. They were enjoyed by the wealthy classes. And so this is what's happening. And often when people are laboring, they're not enjoying the fruits of their own labor because they're the ones that are being exploited for the enjoyment of the wealthy. So you can see how the lasting impact of the Atlantic slave trade, countries that enslaved and exploited and colonized are now the wealthiest countries in the world, and they're the ones that are exploiting the most. And the people that use the least amount of energy, that don't have access to these the products that they make, are the ones that are trafficked 3 and 4 times more than the trafficking that's occurring in the United States. And the trafficking that occurs in the United States, Black, Indigenous, and people of color have a higher level of trafficking than white people. So you can see this long-term effects, and that I brought up the conflict minerals because people are fighting for them. They were high demand minerals that were in existence during the Atlantic slave trade. The high demand products such as tobacco, cotton, chocolate, cocoa, coffee, we're still using them today, and they're considered high demand products, but they're at a lower price point. These products, like gold, is still of tremendous value, and so people are profiting very high off of these products. So what does the church say about all of this? Pope Francis says, and this is coming from Laudato Si', he says, human beings are themselves considered consumer goods to be used and then discarded. We have created a throwaway culture which is now spreading. So this has been embedded into our culture to take people, use them, discard them as if they're things and not people. There's a document that came out of the Second Vatican Council called Gaudium et Spes that kind of formed our Catholic social teaching. Our Catholic social teaching has 7 principles, and one of them is human dignity, and we're called to honor the human dignity of all life. This is what Gaudium et Spes says. It says, whatever insults human dignity, such as subhuman living conditions, arbitrary imprisonment, deportation, slavery, prostitution, the selling of women and children, as well as disgraceful working conditions where men are treated as mere tools for profit rather than as free and responsible persons, all these things and others of their like are infamies indeed. They poison human society, but they do more harm to those who practice them than to those who suffer from injury. Moreover, they are a supreme dishonor to the Creator. So what is being said in this document, that all these things that I just mentioned, the subhuman living conditions, the imprisonment, the slavery, the buying and selling of people, um, which is what is still happening today with modern slavery. All of these things are causing what they call moral injury. They're damaging not just the body, but the body, mind, and soul, because we're body, mind, and soul combined. And it's not just causing harm to the person experiencing the suffering, it's causing a moral injury, a damaging to the soul of the person inflicting that. All because all of us are made in the image and likeness of God, and this causes such a great, tremendous pain for God, because our God is a God of justice, a God of dignity, a God of goodness and of beauty and of truth. And by treating people like objects, we are damaging the very image by which they are created. So last, I want to point us to the Catechism, which is one of our foundational teachings of the church. It says the seventh commandment, and if you remember, the seventh commandment is thou shalt not steal, and human trafficking is stealing the human person and the goods and services and the labor that they have done. The seventh commandment forbids acts or enterprises that for any reason, selfish or ideological, commercial or totalitarian, lead to the enslavement of human beings to their being bought, sold, in exchange for merchandise, is disregarded for the personal dignity. It is a sin against dignity of persons, their fundamental rights to produce them by violence to their productive value or to a source of profit. St. Paul directed a Christian master to treat a slave no longer as slave, but more than a slave, as a beloved brother, both in flesh and in the Lord. So what the Catechism is saying, and what the Catechism is saying, and what we're reminded by St. Paul, is that all of us are made as beloved brothers and sisters, as members of the body of Christ. And by disregarding people, by treating people as merchandise, by treating people as objects, we are disregarding the core of their being, which is infused by God. So what can we do? What are some practical things that we can do? As I pointed out, the modern slavery is directly connected to all these different intersections, but particularly racism. One of the things that we can do is be actively anti-racist. We can also invest our money and our time and our energy into Black, Indigenous, and communities of color. We can stop consuming exploitive content. For example, porn is a big contributor. This is very controversial for some people, but I will cite this one statistic. 84% of Pornhub uploads are real live rapes. And when we justify things calling it sexual liberation, or we call something, we try to downplay the dangers of things like exploitive content, we fail to see that these are all interconnecting points, and that this is what Pope Francis is talking about when he says throwaway culture, when we throw away people. Porn creates, for example, creates a demand for sex trafficking. Another thing that we can do is we can make corporations accountable. We can check out the supply chains, do a quick search. You can look up through, for example, where are my clothes made? And when you find a supply chain, it's very easy to do online. You can call the company up and demand transparency. And there's been lots of changes made from companies like Hershey, for example, that has pledged by this year to become fair trade. And one of the things that we can do, because we have our power is in our pockets, right? If this is a $150 billion industry, our power is in our wallets. We can stop the demand, not just with exploitation, but how we make our purchases. We can ask ourselves, do we need this? Is it ethically made or sourced? Can it wait? And if I buy it, can I buy this rather than buy it from a big box store? Can I buy this product or source from a local spot, from a sustainable spot, from an ethically sourced spot where they know that the wages are going to be fair and equal? And is this a BIPOC owned establishment? These are just a couple of examples of things that you can ask yourself when you are making purchases. So essentially, when we look at these ethical and social justice issues, one of the things that we can do is we can look within and we can start to examine the areas of our lives where maybe we've consumed too much or where we've not valued ourself. If we don't value ourself, how can we value the life and dignity of another person? When have I exploited myself? And tapping into that is how we can narrow down areas of our life where we might be complicit in the demand for trafficked goods. Do I need another cell phone? Do I need this cheap product that's going to fall apart? Do I need to buy it now and push the urgency through, or can it wait? Is this is something that can be purchased locally, or can I uplift a community of a BIPOC community? These are just some as example of a couple of questions. So I want to thank you for this time. There's so much more that I can dive into. If you would like to bring this information, this presentation to your school, please contact me. My name is Samantha again. My email is right there on the screen. It's syanity@ipjc.org. Send me an email. Say, yes, please let's bring this presentation to my school. Or I would like more information. Feel free to email me anytime. Thank you, everyone, and thank you for being part of this breakout session. I look forward to the roundtable discussions with you.